All That's Left is made possible by our supporters. If you can, please subscribe to our Patreon so that we can keep doing this work. Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast by Left Voice. I'm Sam Carliner, and this week we're going to be talking about disability because it is Disability Pride Month. I'm joined in person by my comrade, Olivia Wood, who has been on the show before and will be this week's guest. Hi, Olivia.
Hi.
Olivia and I are both autistic and can speak both personally to some of the ways that capitalism actually creates disability and uses the issue of disability for exploitation. Of course, autism is not the only disability, and not all disabilities exist in the same way, so we're going to also try to provide a theoretical understanding of disability under capitalism that can look at some of the broader issues that the community faces. Before we start talking about the specifics of various disabilities and issues that the disabled community faces, we need to have an understanding of how we are defining disability. And the definition that I'm going to be working with is a definition put forward by the late disability rights activist and scholar Marta Russell. Now, Marta Russell looks at essentially disability as workers who are less exploitable under capitalism than more able-bodied or neurotypical workers. As Marx helps us understand, under capitalism, workers are themselves exploited. Under this system, workers are expected to be as efficient and as productive as possible for the capitalists to squeeze out as much profit as possible. However, as many disability scholars understand and put forward, disability actually comes not from an inherent trait that makes someone disabled, but from a society's inability or unwillingness to accommodate different bodies or brains. So, under capitalism, accommodation actually becomes an added cost that capitalists have to provide if they are going to hire workers who are less able-bodied or who are neurodivergent. So, Olivia, I'm interested, as I've laid all of this out, in what you think of this definition and its validity or not.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this in a couple of different ways. One way being what is even considered a disability in the first place is very often framed around what prevents you from working. And we see this in like a lot of discussions about functioning labels, high functioning or low functioning, and a lot of people make the correct critique that just because someone is labeled high functioning because they're able to have a job or whatever, obfuscates some other support needs that you might have, but because you're able to do that thing, you're not seen as disabled. So there's lots of situations that impact people that you may not necessarily, quote-unquote, need accommodations for in order to do the thing. But that's where they get you, is that they encourage us to say, oh, well, I don't need that. I'll just push myself harder. So even if a person with a given disability is able to literally do the job, whatever the job is, I'll use the example of me. I'm a teacher. Even if I'm able to still teach just as well as anybody else, maybe it's more draining on me. Maybe I need to do more prep work than other people. Maybe I need to do more recovery time, so I'm less able to do other stuff in my life. So in that sense, it's putting these social costs onto the people themselves, because it's still taking up time, but it's not taking up the company's time. And so thinking about what makes us quote-unquote functionally disabled with regard to our jobs, having a lot of things move online meant a lot of people were suddenly more able to do more kinds of work or do the work they already had in different ways or better or whatever. And that's something that I think isn't talked about a lot, is that the increased flexibility in work modality for certain types of jobs, certainly not every job, necessitated by the pandemic, has opened up a lot of things and started a lot of conversations. And unfortunately, a lot of companies are now trying to erase all of that flexibility, like, no, everyone has to come back to work. But remote work has been really valuable for a lot of people in a lot of ways, not just for disability reasons, but for childcare and other stuff.
Well, no, I absolutely appreciate you mentioning that. I mean, one thing I always say, and actually one thing that I didn't really understand about myself until the pandemic, was the extent to which my inability to easily transport myself to a job actually makes me disabled. And I wrote about this, I think in 2020, about how a large part of how I came to have pride in being autistic and understand it as a disability is when I was searching for jobs, so much of what I was able to do for work was limited by the fact that I can't drive. My disability, not all autistic people are unable to drive, but the way that my autism works, I am not able to drive. And that severely limits what opportunities I have, and especially in this country, which has no serious investment in public transportation, that is extremely limiting, and not just limiting, but disabling. So if I didn't have to worry about finding work, if I didn't have to worry about finding work that I can drive to easily, I'm still disabled, but I'm not disabled in that way. But because that is a thing that is not accommodated and that is not invested in, that makes me more disabled in what work I'm able to apply for. And I think it's important, of course, to clarify that while I don't think capitalism can ever be truly equal to disabled people, there are capitalist societies that can provide public transportation. I mean, we see it in many parts of Europe. In Japan, there is investment in public transportation. The US in particular does not invest. But I think that really the mobility issue is such a really great example for understanding how this reality of who is disabled and who isn't, and how does ability, how is it formed based on what is accommodated and based on what is provided by the state or by employers, how that happens in real time. And that is true for me, someone with a more neurological disability, but then of course there's plenty of people with physical disabilities who rely on some form of public transportation in order to live a life similar to neurotypical or able-bodied people.
And I think while certainly we should have universal design of society, so anyone who wants to do a certain job has all the accommodations they need to be able to do that if they want to do that task. I also think it's important to bring it back to like the necessity of wage labor as something that shouldn't be the case. And I'm thinking about specifically, like, normally my job, I teach at the university level, is really well suited to how my brain works. Last semester I had a problem where my school did a good COVID thing and put these filters in all of the classrooms and had the air conditioning on really high to have lots of like airflow. So that's a positive thing from a COVID perspective. From an audio processing perspective, it was a nightmare. And I thought about requesting for some form of accommodation, but I literally couldn't think of what would even be possible in that scenario, because the thing that was causing my issue was very important for an immunodeficiency standpoint. And that situation wouldn't have needed to exist if not for the fact that I do in fact need to work in order to pay bills. And I think that's important to talk about with the pandemic as well, is so much of the situations we've all been forced into wouldn't have had to be a problem if we weren't squeezed by the capitalists to need to work.
Yeah, I mean, that really makes me think of how many jobs I worked that were extremely overstimulating, right? And that realistically, they're not jobs that made sense for me to work. I could do them, but not without getting very overstimulated. And for people who don't know, overstimulation is just an extremely painful experience. It prevents you from being able to take care of other needs. Like, I can't eat, I can't feed myself when I'm overstimulated, and so working these jobs actually prevented me from doing other things that I need to do to live. But anyways, my point is that really makes me think of all of the jobs I've worked that were damaging to me because of my disability, and realistically, the better solution would have been that I don't work these jobs, but the fact is I had to because I need an income. And of course, not everyone who works an awful job that they really realistically are not gaining from and is just hurting them. That's not a disabled thing. Like, there's plenty of people who aren't disabled who work awful jobs that damage them. That's a feature of capitalism, but there are specific ways in which certain jobs will be more harmful to someone with a disability, and yet we still have to work them because that might be the job that we're able to find, that we're able to get a necessary income from. And realistically, if we just had a society where you don't need to work to provide basic needs, then this wouldn't be an issue. And that's one way in which disabled people are harmed. I also want to talk about the contrast, for lack of a better word, the contrast that a lot of disabled people face, which is we still need income to take care of ourselves, but can't get hired. I mean, so many disabled people are not able to find work. They won't be employed either because of their physical disability preventing them from being able to do certain jobs, or maybe they can do those jobs with accommodations, but the employer won't provide accommodation, or just in general, something about your disability makes you less desirable. Like, I'm so bad at doing job interviews because I have a disability that literally makes it harder for me to answer questions, even questions about myself. Like, I can't form sentences as quickly as more neurotypical workers, and that is inherently a barrier to getting employed as easily. And so there's all these different ways that disabled people maybe don't want to, not maybe, no one wants to be exploited, but we do want to be able to provide for ourselves. And as it currently stands, we need work to be able to provide for ourselves and can't always get that. And I bring this up to touch on what Marx explains as the reserve army of labor. So capitalism relies on having a permanent reserve army of labor, people who are not employed for whatever reason, but are there for the capitalists to offer employment if offering employment to this reserve army benefits them. And a big part of that is that capitalism cannot provide everyone with a job, right? Because that would mean that if workers start organizing, what are capitalists going to do? Like, every worker is employed, whereas if you have the reserve army of labor and workers start organizing, oh, well, you can just fire these workers who are causing problems for you because you have this really like pool to choose from of workers who are probably more desperate for whatever reason because they can't get employed and are going to be more willing to put up with an exploitative working environment because they need employment. And so disabled people, for all the reasons we got into about prevention or barriers to finding employment, for all those reasons, disabled people are far more likely to be in the reserve army of labor and thus, not able to provide for ourselves and subjected to lives where we're either not able to provide for our needs or we have to find other precarious positions, whether that's being fully dependent on our families or, for example, the ADA, right? And there's so many barriers to even getting the disability benefits that the government supposedly provides, and they're insufficient. But it's also an issue that if you want those benefits, and assuming you do qualify because of your disability, then the government just has really a registry of disabled people. The state has a registry of disabled people, and that's not good. We don't want that. So it's really just an awful system that provides no truly equal or liberatory options for disabled people because it relies on us being in some form of precarious or exploitative situation in order to maintain itself, right? And I think it's really important that you bring up how the pandemic has changed or opened a lot of conversation because there's really two things going on right now. The pandemic has actually created more disabled people, right? There's people, I don't know the exact numbers, but there are people who maybe were not disabled before, but because they got COVID, they have now physical symptoms that make them less able-bodied, or they have brain fog that makes them less able to focus and act quickly on the job. So that's an issue where people are new to being disabled in a lot of cases. But then you have when we get into the question of the reserve army of labor, we're actually seeing now, because of the economic crises that the pandemic, as well as just the general contradictions of capitalism and the war in Ukraine and all sorts of things, because of the economic situation that is happening, and because capital is facing a crisis, you have economists saying, oh, well, the way to fix this problem and to maintain the interests of capital is actually the workforce is right now too big. Too many people are employed, and we need to increase unemployment. And so people who are disabled but maybe were able to find some form of work are now going to be added to this reserve army of labor again. And this includes people who maybe wouldn't have been put in this situation before, but because they're newly disabled, they might find themselves in that position. And let's be clear, right? It's not just awful for disabled people to be unemployed. The unemployment itself is a form of violence, but it is a form of violence that certainly for all the reasons I've laid out, is more inclined to impact disabled people. And I think it'll be interesting to see if there are people who are new to facing that experience of having a disability and that preventing them from finding work.
Yeah, and I think to connect those, in some ways we have to look at the spread of where in the economy this is happening. Like, for instance, long COVID among pilots is part of the reason we're having so many flight cancellations and difficulty staffing flights, because they laid off a bunch of pilots during the pandemic and flight attendants and other airline workers. And now enough pilots have too much brain fog to be able to fly safely, and that's contributing to the ability to do that. So that is proving to be a problem for capitalists. That's bad. Need more pilots. But I'm certainly thinking about a lot of disabled activists have been saying, I mean, for years now, because we're years into the pandemic, as different companies were trying to like open back up again, saying like, where were all of these accommodations when we were asking for them? Now that everyone needs remote work, for example, childcare flexibility, for example, when schools were online. Clearly you were able to afford it all along. You just didn't want to give it to us. And like I was saying earlier, now that's being withdrawn, which I think is really illustrative of how like the money exists for this if it's necessary. It's just in certain circumstances it's not necessary because there's enough other people who you can get to do the work. So then you have disabled people who are either unemployed in the legal sense, like don't have a job but want to have a job, are looking for work. Unemployed in the sense of can't work or are not looking for work. And then precariously employed folks who may get laid off anytime because, oh, what if you're too much of a burden now? Or just precarious in the more general sense, like gig workers, things like that, people without benefits. And each of those components contributes to the reserve army of labor. And I think that's another piece of the employment puzzle, is just because lots of people have jobs doesn't mean they're full-time jobs, doesn't mean they're enough to pay the bills, or anything like that. So we're having high employment combined with terrible working conditions and people not being able to provide for their own basic needs or the needs of their families. And still lots of places saying they're looking for work, and then I don't even know what's going on with that.
Yeah, so there are all these ways that capitalism both creates and exploits and worsens disability, but there's also plenty of other institutional forms of ableism that we haven't addressed that I hope you can talk about more.
Yeah, and I feel bad that I didn't bring this stuff up earlier, and I'm sure there's things that I don't even know about because I haven't had direct contact with it in my life, but here's some things that I do know about. We already touched on how the ADA is horribly limited. There's a set amount of accommodation, or not amount, set of accommodations that you can get under the ADA in like the drop-down menus in accommodations offices and stuff, and it's hard to get stuff outside of that. But it's very one-size-fits-all, and you might have needs that your institution just can't compute of how to accommodate for you, if they're even willing to accommodate for you. And then job postings have all these like secret things built in to weed out disabled people without asking about it, like, can you drive? Can you lift over 50 pounds? Can you do XYZ? Like, I see the 50 pounds things on like teaching jobs, and I've never had to lift 50 pounds for my job, ever. Things like that. There's a lower minimum wage for disabled workers. I'm not totally sure what the criteria for who falls under that umbrella is. But that's bullshit. If people are doing the work, they should get paid what everybody else gets paid. And then for disabled adults, if you want to get disability benefits, there's income caps. Same with other kind of government benefits. If you make too much money, they stop giving you your benefits, but there's a huge gap between what the cap is and what's actually livable. So you actually can't work more, even if you can and want to, because then you're forfeiting your benefits. Same deal with marriage. If you're married, you just can't get certain kinds of benefits because they just assume that via being married, your partner must make enough money, so you don't need this money. And so if you can't get married for that reason, then you're also losing out on all of the other many financial and other kinds of benefits that come with the legal status of marriage.
Well, before we started recording, this isn't as much of an issue in the U.S., although Martha Russell does write a lot about this. I keep mentioning her. I will plug that a lot of my understanding of her work comes from a really great book of essays, Capitalism and Disability at Haymarket. Great book, which talks about these things much more in depth than we're covering. But I will say one thing that she brings up that was a huge issue at the time that she was alive and writing is the issue of euthanasia and how it's treated as this humane thing, but actually isn't, and actually is in many ways a form of eugenics against disabled people. And you were saying that right now there's an ongoing discussion or issue of this in Canada. I wonder if you can talk more about that.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about it, but my understanding is that they've passed a new bill that will increase access to assisted suicide. And what a lot of its critics are saying is to do this without improving access to different forms of medical care is essentially forcing people to choose their own euthanasia, even when there's treatments that could substantially improve their quality of life that are just inaccessible for various reasons. And I think the comparisons to the U.S. are obvious because our healthcare system is trash and lots of specialty care. Most specialty care is really expensive, often out of network. So there can be stuff that exists that could help you, but if you can't pay for it, and we know you can't make a lot of money because of the benefits thing necessarily, what are you supposed to do? There's so much needless suffering that could be avoided. It's just not, because it would be too expensive or too much of a burden or whatever. And God forbid we give everyone universal health care.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's just so many awful things that the state does. And I think one thing we really actually do need to talk about is also the issue of disability, and the way it's created is particularly an issue for Black communities, brown communities, communities abroad, victims of U.S. imperialism. And a lot of times these are stories that we don't hear, but as we know, the impact of environmental racism, pollution that causes disability, the trauma inflicted on people who are subjected to violence by the state, that is a disability issue, right? And in many ways, the issue of disability doesn't come up because so many of these communities aren't diagnosed properly. They don't have the resources to even explore that. And it's dealt with through eugenics or through incarceration, incarceration being a big one. And I just think that we have to mention that, and if there's anything I'm forgetting, please bring it up, but we do have to discuss, again, there's so many ways that the state and the dynamics of capitalism create such a violent situation for disabled people that really, without a full overthrow of this system, just will keep perpetrating this violence. I don't think there's any way that you can keep capitalism as a system in place and really have equality for disabled people. Yeah.
And I guess I'll add to that labor under capitalism in and of itself is very often disabling itself. If you're staring at a computer screen for 40 plus hours a week, every week for 40 years, that's going to do something to your eyesight. If you're doing some kind of repetitive physical labor, that's going to impact you. That's something that we don't talk about because it's very small and accumulates over time. But that's also very real and true.
I remember reading, it was about during the pandemic, bus drivers. I don't remember the overall point of the piece, but one thing that it brought up is that bus drivers in particular suffer from, and in New York City, but I'm sure other cities, suffer from a condition. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's essentially driving over these little bumps, but like doing that constantly for years on ends causes their bones to just become so brittle and just crack and degrade over time, and it creates this horrible condition that generally is not accommodated. And so that's just another example of what you're getting at, this way that the exploitation of the worker disables the body, disables the mind, and then does not provide for these people, for workers, once they have become disabled. And it's just a really awful form of violence, and we are going to need socialism to really deal with this. But I also think what we need to discuss is that socialists are not inherently free of ableism, and I think in many ways there isn't really much discussion around disability, even within left spaces. I feel like, for example, as I said at the beginning, we're recording this episode because it is Disability Pride Month. I wonder how many people know that it's Disability Pride Month. It comes right after LGBT Pride Month, LGBTQ plus Pride Month, which absolutely deserves recognition. I'm queer, you're queer. I'm not trying to knock that, but I do think it is this interesting dynamic where we have this one thing that is very well established on the left, and then the next month, Disability Pride Month, you barely even hear about. And I want to tell a story which I think really highlights some of the failures of the left, and that is that both you and I were last month in attendance at the Labor Notes Conference, a really inspiring event. For a weekend, we were meeting with the vanguard of the labor movement, and I attended a session that was specific to disability. I don't remember the exact title, but it was, I believe, the only session that was focused on ableism in the workplace, and it didn't have the best turnout. Not many people were there. I'm glad that there were some people there, but one thing that was acknowledged is that even the conference itself, this supposedly very left, very worker considerate conference, and not supposedly, in many ways it was, but it did not have accommodations to the point that at one point a person in a wheelchair was leaving the session on disability and was trying to open the door, and someone pointed out, oh, there's a button right there that will help you automatically open the door. And so the person goes to press the button, and the door still doesn't open. So in the room that this conference is holding, it's one panel on ableism in the workplace. The door that is supposed to accommodate disabled people does not work. And this is not the only example of accommodations not even being made by really the movement that should be fighting for disabled people. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts on that and how the left really could be doing a better job at taking up disability issues.
Yeah, and I think to answer that, I want to tell the story of how I came to understand myself as disabled, because it relates a lot to this. It was twofold. One was listening to comrades like you, like Nathaniel, like my friend Cody, who I know through work, just talking about how autism affects their lives. And I was like, this is really relatable. Maybe there's something there. But the other component was going to work conferences and giving myself permission to use some of the accommodations that were there. And it started with really simple things that I was surprised that Labor Notes wasn't encouraging, like having paper copies of talks. Just a handful and you asked at the beginning of the session, hey, does anyone here want a paper copy? And I started being like, you know what, I do want a paper copy. I prefer to read along while someone is speaking. Really, really simple things like that. Some other accommodations that are common at the conferences I go to for work, and let me be very clear, disability activists within my field of work are very critical of all the ways that our conferences could be even more accessible, but some other things that we have are space for interpreters, closed captioning. The last conference I went to before the pandemic had little name tag flags that were color coded to indicate your comfort with different kinds of interaction. Green was like, please interact with me. Yellow was like, please interact with me only if we already know each other. And then red was like, please do not interact with me. I need to be by myself right now.
And sorry to cut you off, but I will say that you told me about that, and ever since, like, I'm just always going to crave that. I wish we could just have that be how all always available as an understood thing. But anyways, please continue.
And like having a quiet room where the whole purpose is just it's a room at the conference location. And this is important because not everyone has a hotel room at the conference location. Where you can just go and sit and be quiet, and that's what the room is for. Things like that. And it was using accommodations and realizing how much it helped and like genuinely did improve my quality of life that made me think, maybe I am disabled if accommodations designed for disabled people help me. But these are also kinds of things that are helpful just to have in general. And so that's my thought about conferences and labor notes, and how I think the fact that some of this stuff wasn't present shows a less awareness of these issues. I also think that disability is a really, really broad category. And even with people with the same diagnosis, like Sam and I, we have different needs, and different levels and intensities and whatever of the same needs. And so there's a lot more education, like self-education or community education, that needs to go into figuring out how can we be as accessible as possible. I think the other problem is left groups need to think more carefully about when we call on people to mobilize for whatever. How do we make that as accessible as possible? And one of the ways is making marches accessible, like having wheelchairs, having bathrooms, publicizing march routes. Like there's ways that many march organizers do already do to make those more accessible. But also, if you can't go to a march for whatever reason, are the organizers publicizing other ways that you can participate, either in that specific event or contributing to the cause in some other way? And especially now that we have the internet as a thing, there's so many ways people can contribute. And I never want someone who's disabled to feel like they can't participate in, the movement for socialism just because there isn't an accessible way for them to get plugged in. And I think that's a big problem that we have on the left and something that we need to think about, both for its own sake and also once people get in the room, they're going to have all kinds of ideas for how to make stuff even more accessible that just isn't being talked about or isn't being publicized in the same way. And I think we need to just figure out how to make those two communities and sets of conversations overlap more.
Yeah, and no, I'm really glad you mentioned the issue of mobilizations, because I do feel like, and obviously not all of the left, but certainly in parts of the left, there's this idea that if you're not mobilizing, if you're not showing up in the streets, what are you doing? And actually, there's a whole, I think, discussion to be had that we've discussed in Left Voice about the issue with this movementist mindset that, like, just protesting is how you get change. But that's a whole separate discussion. But there is also, I think, there needs to be an understanding that not everyone can do that, and there need to be other ways for people to contribute, I put off for the longest time doing political work, which is something that I've wanted to do always, but I put it off because of some of the expectations of what doing political work looks like. Like, I'm now able to read. I found ways to be able to read, but my disability used to make it very difficult for me to even just read. And one thing that I think was really helpful was Left Voice made a lot of these really fundamental texts more accessible to work through, and I think that is really a thing, that there needs to be essentially an understanding that just reading big texts and mobilizing aren't things that everyone can do or can't do as easily, and how can you accommodate that? But I really do think a point that you make that's really important is that there does need to be essentially even just more beginning discussion and education. We've acknowledged this at the start of the episode, but one thing that's worth clarifying is there's a lot that we're not covering in this episode. And part of that is we could do a better job at understanding, for example, physical disabilities that we don't have, or even different ways of being neurodivergent that we don't experience. As you mentioned, the spectrum of what is disability is so broad, and even people with the same disability don't experience it the same way. I do also think there's a very real issue of not that people aren't writing about disability, but that it's not publicized as much. This is also super anecdotal, but I think about when people talk about intersectionality or list different types of oppression. They'll bring up racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. I feel like I rarely see the word ableism included in these lists, and I wish I had an answer. I don't exactly know what the answer is, but I do think that there is a very real issue of disabled voices not being platformed as much. We don't even need to talk about it. I don't think we have the time for it on this episode, but we could have a whole discussion about, I think, the damage that Autism Speaks has done, and just in general on the issue of autism, neurotypical people speaking constantly on behalf of autistic people, and hence why we now put forward the term actually autistic, because the fact is there's been so many cases where people who aren't disabled determine when there is even a discussion of disability and how that discussion is had. So I think there is so much work that needs to be done on addressing just that lack of platform.
Can I say something about Autism Speaks?
Oh, go ahead.
So, I have thankfully not had a lot of contact with Autism Speaks, but I do want to point out, to tie back to capitalism, that this is one example of part of the nonprofit industrial complex of organizations that sprout up to talk about a topic, raise a lot of money about a topic, make a lot of money about a topic, and then either not do much to actually help the topic, or in this case, do a lot of harm around the topic.
I am willing to say that Autism Speaks is a hate group. They literally had a member of their board of directors film a video where she's sitting next to her autistic daughter and talks about how she considered committing murder-suicide because her autistic daughter made her life so difficult.
It's fucking horrible.
They're a hate group. Don't support Autism Speaks ever. Ever. Never. No, but I do think that, I mean, there's so much that we are not covering that needs to be covered. But before we go, I do want to talk about a phrase that I think can serve as the basis for an understanding of how we incorporate disability. And that is banger Karl Marx quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." And that is how, of course, how it's interpreted, it varies, and I'm interested in getting your take on how you interpret it, but I think the idea of understanding what is a person's ability, what are they able to do, whether in larger society or within just whatever left organization they're a part of, and what are their needs, and how do we provide for that, should serve as the basis of accommodation. And I wonder what you think of that quote and how we can start to truly implement it.
Something I've been sort of worried that we weren't clear enough about this earlier in the episode. It is important to have accommodations at work, but also getting people to be able to work is not the be-all end-goal of things. But about this quote, I mean, it makes me think of my very favorite part of the German ideology about how you do one thing in the morning and one thing in the afternoon and one thing in the evening. And people, including disabled people, like to do stuff.
I love doing stuff.
I love doing stuff. And I'm fortunate to be in a wage labor job that I usually really enjoy. But people like to do stuff. And people should be able to do whatever stuff that they want to do, whether that's a necessary piece of labor for the functioning of society or something else. If they want to, and to the extent that they want to. And if you like to, I don't know, let me back up. There's some jobs I cannot do. I can never be a bus driver. I am able to drive, theoretically. I have my license, but neither me nor anyone else wants me to drive. So I cannot be a bus driver. There is no amount of accommodation, short of removing everyone else from the road, that would make me able to be a bus driver. But there's jobs like working in a restaurant that, because of the high intensity and high pace and high demands of how that works in capitalist society, I would burn out really fast if I did that. But that's the sort of job with appropriate accommodations and a shift in how that even works, such as in a socialist society, I could do that. So that's something I think about, is under socialism, how would things change? So not just that all the necessary parts of people's needs getting met and society functioning gets to happen, but also what changes do we make so that everyone gets to do the activities, whether it's a labor thing or not, that they want to do. And it's a weird balance to try and strike of one thing disability activists do is like, disabled people contribute so much to society, which is true. But at the same time, we shouldn't measure our value based on our ability to contribute to society. And so I don't know, that's sort of a roundabout way of answering your question. But I definitely do love from each according to their ability to each according to their need. And And I also think that what our abilities are and what our needs are change day to day, hour to hour, whatever. And we should also have a society that's flexible enough to adjust to changing abilities and needs as well.
Well, on that note, I think this has been a really great conversation, and I would just like to wish everyone a happy Disability Pride Month.